So, did you refactor the code on your own? Here's how I would refactor this. As mentioned, I'll keep event prevent default here, but I then want to grab this code and put it into a separate function which takes care about extracting input data from the incoming data object, the form object here. For this in parser.js, which sounds like a fitting file since this is a file dealing with parsing user input, I will export a new function which I'll name extract entered number values. The name, of course, is up to you. And here I do expect to get the form from which I do want to extract data. Then I paste in those 2 lines of code which I selected. And I return my number inputs thereafter. So that's this function. And back in app.js, we can then use this function. And instead of having this code here, we then call extract entered number values here. We make sure that we import extract entered number values from the parser.js file. We can get rid of that extract numbers import here because we're not calling that function in this app.js file anymore. And here where I am calling extract entered number values, I of course want to store those number input values or those number values or however you want to call them into a separate variable or constant. So that's the first step. As a next step, I want to derive the result. And for this, we'll of course have to clean and transform the input and then get the actual result. Nonetheless, as a first step, I will basically cut all this code, this try-catch block from app.js, and then go to math.js maybe, because that sounds like a file that should be involved with deriving results. In there, I'll add a new function, calculate result, where I expect to get my number values, so the values we got from the user input. And then in there, I have my try-catch block. But I then also want to split this up even further, because cleaning that input, validating it, and transforming it is something which doesn't really belong into this function, I would argue. Instead, I would rather get my numbers here by calling another function. So I will cut this for loop code here from math.js and maybe go to numbers.js, though it's of course up to you in which file you want to do what. And in this numbers.js file here, I will export another function which I'll name clean numbers. And that's why I place it in this file, because this function is responsible for giving us some numeric numbers, some numbers of type number. And here I expect to get my number values, which is the user input we got, but those numbers are all text, are all strings. And then here I will add my numbers array. I then loop through all my number values here, get my number inputs. And I then want to call validate, transform, and so on, push those cleaned numbers onto the numbers array, and ultimately return the numbers array. Of course, now since I'm calling validate string not empty and transform number and validate number here, I need to import those things here. I mean, transform to number is already in that file, but I need to import those validation functions, and I will import them from the validation.js file like this. And so from that file, I import validate string not empty and validate number. These two things get imported here. And then we get the clean numbers function, which is responsible for, well, transforming and cleaning the numbers. And back in math.js, my numbers should then simply be returned by that function. So here in calculate result, I will call clean numbers. And you need to import this from util numbers.js. And I call clean numbers and forward my number values. And what I get back are the cleaned numbers with which we can then work here. And then I want to call add on those numbers. And of course, I want to have my result, which is an empty string initially, and which is then either the sum converted to a string or this error message. Now we could also outsource this conversion to a string into a separate function, because I did technically do that for transform to number. That's also a function that just returns the transformed value transformed to an integer. And therefore, we could also outsource the transformation to a string into a separate function. But since I already mentioned that this transform to number function is also maybe not too important, and I primarily added it so that we could write more tests, I will not outsource this into a separate function, but you could absolutely do that. What is important and not optional though is that you return the result in the end here in calculate result. And with that, we can go back to app.js, and here my result is now the result of calling calculate result, which of course must be imported from Moth.js. And you can, on the other hand, get rid of the add import, of these validation function imports, and of the transform to number import. So now we got the result here. Of course, to get that result, we need to forward our number values to calculate result. And here, to extract entered number values, we also should forward our form, of course, so that the values can be extracted from that form. So these are more important steps forward. Now I also want to outsource this code where we get the result text, and hence I will cut this and go to a new file, which I'll name output.js next to parser.js. And in this output.js file, I will export a function called generate result text, where I get the, let's say, calculation result, which is a number or an error message. And then here, I use this calculation result and check if it holds a text of invalid or no calc, which are these error codes that it might hold if it doesn't hold a number output. And then I set my result text appropriately and I return that result text thereafter. And with that back in app.js, we can of course call this new function. So here we can get the result text by calling generate result text and passing our result, which we got from line 12, into this function. And of course, you must import generate result text from that newly added output.js file. And as mentioned, I'll also put this code into a separate function thereafter because it could become more complex over time. And therefore, in output.js, I will export a function which I'll name output result, where I get some result text as a parameter, and I then access the DOM to output this result text. And now, of course, I want to make sure that I also have that DOM element, that output element available here. So in app.js, I will grab this output element, cut it from there, and add this code here in this output result function. Alternatively, we could also add it outside of this function so that this element is only selected once, but maybe we got other code that conditionally removes this element or something like this, and therefore I always want to reselect it here when we need it. And in app.js, we now can call output result, and we of course also import it, and we pass our result text to output result. And now we got a much leaner app.js file, and I of course want to test whether it still works. So I will navigate into the basic testing frontend folder, run npm install to install all dependencies, and npm start thereafter to start this development server. And if you then visit localhost 8080, you should still be able to work with this, though I am getting an unexpected output here. So something is wrong here. And yeah, the error is related to line 7 in the output.js file. Of course, I want to concatenate my calculation result here, since I renamed that variable. With that, if we save this all, and we now reload this page, now it should work as expected, also if we submit an empty form. So it's working as before, but we now refactored app.js, and this can now, as mentioned, help us with testing. We still might not want to write a test for this overall function right now, but we can now write some tests for functions like the generate result text function here. So that are things we can now do, and we weren't able to test those units before because we didn't have them as separate units. And of course, that's the idea behind unit testing. As mentioned earlier in the course already, you want to have granular units, functions typically, for which you then write your tests so that you can test those different behaviors standalone, independent from each other.